It's a real pleasure to come here, and Chris's introduction is over-generous, of course, but that's the role of people who introduce speakers, is to be over-generous. But anyway, let me start by saying a little bit about who I am and what my main interests were and are today. You know, I remain very actively interested in hunter-gatherer studies and hope to continue to be so for some time, so my hearing doesn't go entirely. It's deteriorating the whole time, sadly. But I'm sure if you ask questions or make comments that I can't hear, that I'll have an excellent translator who will interpret them for me. Anyway, I'm a social anthropologist. I'm concerned with societies, and I taught social anthropology first at University College, London, from 1962 to 1965, and then from 1965 until I retired in 1999 at the London School of Economics. Now, I didn't want to retire, but in those days they pushed you out at 65. And I said, I want to continue at least part-time, and they said, we can't, it would create a precedent. And anyway, so sadly, hunter-gatherer studies are largely dead at the LSE these days, but very actively alive at University College, where Jerome Lewis is and who's actively promoting the subject. I've always been particularly interested in hunter-gatherer societies and in their social systems. And by social systems, I mean their system of social relationships, their way that individuals within these societies relate to each other, and the nature of the social groupings in these societies. What kind of social groupings do you have? What do I mean by the term hunter-gatherer? In one sense, we're all hunter-gatherers. All human beings lived exclusively by hunting wild creatures, animals, birds, fish, snails, insects, and no doubt other things that I haven't listed there, and by gathering edible wild plant products, roots, fruits, berries, seeds, leaves, the honey of wild bees, for approaching 99% of human existence, if we date the emergence of humanity, modern Homo sapiens, at 500,000 or so years ago. All our fundamental characteristics and potentialities, physical, mental, cultural, social, were developed during this vast period of vast time span, and some of them even earlier. It seems unlikely that much human genetic change has occurred since the first domestication of wild animals and the first cultivation of plants just a few thousand years ago. We are all hunter-gatherers, whether we like it or not. That's what we are, physically and mentally. And if we were to have the good fortune to be able to meet a hunter-gatherer of the pre-agricultural period and to give him the kind of education and skills that we have today, he would be exactly like us. I mean, really no different. And the idea that people in the pre-agricultural period were different is a whole lot of nonsense. They weren't. They were us. They were not merely like us. They were us. That's what we are and what they are. How can we best understand what the hunting and gathering way of life is like, and what it was like before the Neolithic Revolution, before the development of agriculture and pastoralism and pottery and metalworking and all those things that have occurred in the last few thousand years. It seems to me that the first and basic requirement for understanding the operation of the hunting and gathering way of life is both in hunting and gathering way of life, both in the past and in the present, is through detailed observation and data gathering among contemporary hunter-gatherers. archaeologists often talk as though looking at contemporary hunter-gatherers is irrelevant. And it's positively not irrelevant. It is through looking at contemporary hunter-gatherers that we can understand what this way of life involves. Of course, modern hunter-gatherers have access to some metal, have access to some of the things that have happened since the Neolithic Revolution, but I don't believe these things make much difference to the fundamentals of their way of life. And it's understanding the fundamentals of their way of life that is the challenge. And this can only be done through detailed observation and data gathering. We have nonsenses in hunter-gatherer studies of the use of things like the human relations area files in America, in which they endlessly lump good data and bad data together. Travelers' tales about hunter-gatherers are put are not distinguished sufficiently from detailed modern data based on systematic observation and data gathering. And it just means nonsense, that their generalizations are nonsensical. What is needed is really detailed scrutiny. I mean, nobody lumps together the observations of astronomers as they were in the past and believes that they're similar to those of today, or the doctrines of medicine before medicine really started to develop in the in the 19th century. It's nonsense. What we should be looking at is data gathered when we began to do this really systematically and in detail and based on systematic observation and not on just a passing through on some visit 100 years ago. Travelers' tales are almost worthless. If you look at Darwin's observations on the Fijians, it's a typical example of nonsense. I mean, Darwin, a highly, highly intelligent man, really made no sense at all of the Fijians that he encountered at the Tierra del Fuego on his way through. I mean, it's a kind of tragedy that there was no detailed scrutiny of them before they became extinct, as they are now. Basically, they have disappeared, and there are traces of them in the genetic structures of surviving neighboring groups, but basically they've gone, and we shall never know exactly how they lived. There are some better accounts of Darwin's, but they're very inadequate. So, I mean, this is really, as you can see, it's a kind of, you can see how biased this is by my point of view. What I'm saying, basically, as you can see, is that it's my data that matter. Nobody else's data, none of these travellers' tales in early times really matter. But so you can take it or leave it. You can accept it or not accept it as you choose. Now, contemporary hunter-gatherers, what do I mean by hunter-gatherers in the modern world? Contemporary hunter-gatherers are those peoples who lived or have lived exclusively or primarily on wild products, which they have obtained for themselves from the natural environment in recent, that they've obtained in recent times from the natural environment. That is, during the last 100 years or so, when observation, data gathering, and data recording have become more reliable. Now, we can use some of the accounts of Australian Aborigines, the works of people like Spencer and Gillan, which were based on fairly detailed accounts. They're not up to modern standards. They are interesting, but we still know relatively little about Australian Aborigines, and sadly, we never will know in real detail about how they function, because we've got scarcely any modern studies while they were still living by hunting and gathering and not obtaining their food from missionaries and other groups. We have some usable data on the Inuit, on the people who used to be known as Eskimo, some other North American and South American societies, and on a few Australian Aboriginal societies. But these American and Australian systems were mostly seriously disrupted before the emergence of the generally higher quality field research techniques developed in anthropology from the 1930s onwards. So really, it's very difficult using the North American data and the Australian data, because although the data is variable and there is some interesting and important data, it's not really up to modern standards. I started my field research among a hunter-gatherer group, the Hadza, in 1957. And there were then rather few people still living exclusively by hunting and gathering. There are now far fewer. Sadly, we're witnessing just the tail end of the hunting and gathering way of life, through though some instances may carry on for a few more generations, and I hope for several more generations. You know, the Hadza, quite a proportion of the Hadza, not all, but quite a proportion of them, are still hunting and gathering, but for how long? It's not really possible to be very optimistic about how many generations they'll continue for. From the 1950s onwards, a great deal of detailed research has been carried out among previously neglected peoples. I mean, neglected by researchers, but still living by hunting and gathering, and especially those in Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. I mean, it's very extraordinary, really, but for some reason they didn't attract the same attention early on as the Australian Aboriginals did and as the North American peoples did. The 1965 conference in Chicago on Man the Hunter, and many later conferences on hunter-gatherer societies, have brought together much of this work and have helped to stimulate new work. The most recent hunter-gatherer conference was held in Liverpool a year or two ago, and the next one is to be held in Vienna in September this year. For me, this is a really exciting prospect, particularly because archaeological work on hunter-gatherer societies and the work of biological anthropologists are at long last, being brought together. You know, at last we're getting good data on some aspects of biological anthropology and some aspects of archaeology, although we still get in archaeology quite a lot of, we quite often get examples of biological determinism, in which people argue that once you understand the environment, you understand people's way of life, which is nonsense. And in biological anthropology, we get biological determinism, in which some biological anthropologists are stupid enough to believe that
Can you all hear? Is it all right?
Once you understand biology, you understand everything. Yes, please, if you can't hear, please say so loudly.
Come a bit closer, otherwise.
Now, that's my introduction. Now let me go on to my own work, my field research and my interest in comparative studies. I've spent years and years living among one particular hunter-gatherer group, the Hadza of northern Tanzania. Starting with a 3-year period of intensive field research for my PhD, which was from 1957 till 1960, I've been back many, many times back visiting them repeatedly ever since. In fact, it's really quite surprising that I'm here now, because at the end of my 3-year stint, I was very tempted just to stay on. And in that case, you'd never have seen me. I'd just have been there. I even took out a prospector's license in the hope that I might discover, some wonderful mineral on the surface, diamonds or something like that, and would be able to sell these and get enough money to be able to live there forever. Not quite like a Hadza, but like a modified Hadza. But anyway, it didn't work out. I never found anything. And so here I am. I got all sorts of pressure from my PhD supervisors to get back. And they said, if you don't come back now, we won't accept you for the PhD. You've got to come back. So after having sold my car and used all the car proceeds to stay on as long as I could, I eventually ran out of cash and came back to the UK. Now, all those years ago, in 1957, why did I do field research among the Hadza? What led me to choose the Hadza? As a university student taking a degree in archaeology and anthropology, I'd become interested in hunter-gatherers partly because of my perversity, because they were frequently mentioned, but there was no systematic teaching on them. So I thought, by God, I've got to find out who these people are, because people won't tell me who they are or how they live. So just to be awkward, I thought I'd better do something about it. The best-known books in the British tradition on hunter-gatherers at that time were probably Shapira's book on the Khoisan peoples, that is the people, the Bushmen and the Hottentots of southern Africa, Radcliffe Brown's book on the Andaman Islanders, and Lloyd Warner's book on the Muangin Aborigines of northern Australia. All these had very obvious strengths, but also very obvious weaknesses. But among the weaknesses, I felt that none of them provided what I thought was a clear and coherent account of the operation of a hunter-gatherer social system. We had all sorts of, from Lloyd Warner is interesting because he gave us a highly idealized account of the operation of the kinship system of the Muangin in Australia, but didn't really tell us nearly enough about how people organized their daily lives, what their camps consisted of, or how people resolved disputes. All sorts of matters of this sort are kind of glossed over in terms of this actually wonderful presentation of their idealized life. Anyway, I started searching for an interesting hunter-gatherer group to study, and I came across bits and pieces of material on the Hadza. I mean, in quite obscure places, actually. There was some stuff published in Germany during the war, and you can imagine how difficult it was to find that in British libraries. I got it with difficulty, and actually it includes some of the best material that exists on the Hadza. For me, the key issue was, are these people who were then described as the Watindiga or Hadzapi, both misnomers, as I shall explain. But for me, the question was, what has happened to these people? Are they still living by hunting and gathering? Because what I don't want to do, or what I didn't want to do, was to go to study some kind of fragment of what had once been a functioning society. I wanted to know whether they still were living by hunting and gathering. Two pieces of really, really important information for me at that time, just as I was completing my undergraduate degree, were two things. I found an article in a journal called Tanganyika Notes and Records, which is basically a series of bits and pieces by colonial administrators, but an article by a game man, a man who was involved with the game department called Cooper, and he wrote about his encounters with the Hadza, and it was clear that the article was relatively recent then. It was, I think, published in the late 1940s, something like that, just a few years before I went out in 1957. And it was very clear from his article that people were still living an active life as hunter-gatherers. But the second thing was even more important. It was the visit, and it just happened that, Tanzania was still administered by Britain. It wasn't a colony in the usual sense. It was a United Nations Trust territory, which was administered by Britain. And it was then Tanganyika, not Tanzania, as it became after the union with Zanzibar, which was separate at that time. But anyway, in Tanganyika, it happened that I heard that an administrator from Tanganyika called Henry Fosbrook was visiting Cambridge, and I managed to meet him. And he had actually personally encountered the Hadza and had written a short article about their material culture. And what he said to me was, "Oh yes, you can go and live in the nearest government centre and call people in and interview them there." And I was outraged. This wasn't my idea of how you should do your work, summoning people in and interviewing them. Anyway, what he did tell me was what was really important was that people were still living by hunting and gathering. And he had really up-to-date information. And that was what I needed. And so I then set about collecting funds to study them. Now, in those days, you got £100 from one fund and £100 from another, sort of bits and pieces. And I set about gathering this, and after a long struggle, I was able to get enough to go. Now, in those days, we didn't do any, it's mad to think about it, but we didn't do any preparation for field research. I got my undergraduate degree in June 1957. By October, I was in the field, and I hadn't the faintest idea of what I was supposed to be doing. Not the faintest idea. I'd read quite a lot about hunter-gatherers, but I really hadn't thought now, what are my procedures going to be? What am I going to do? And I was under all sorts of delusions. I thought that when I got out there, that, it's administered by Britain. I'm bound to find somebody among us who can speak English and who will interpret and so that help me to learn the language. Nonsense. There was nobody who spoke English and who spoke Hadza. Not one. And I can tell you about the kind of agonizing experiences of beginning of field work, but I'm going to gloss over those for the moment. I've talked about those as Chris and others will have heard on previous occasions, but you can ask me about it later if you want. But at any rate, it was a kind of agonizing thing because I had no means of communication. I didn't speak the lingua franca of Tanzania, Swahili, but then nor did the Hadza. Only about, of the 1,000 Hadza, roughly 1,000, it was a bit fewer then. There were less than 1,000 at that time. But of that number, maybe about half a dozen people had some knowledge of Swahili. Lots of people could do the greetings, but going beyond that, scarcely anybody knew Swahili then. And so, no English speaker, hardly any Swahili speakers, and then this language, which is a language isolate. It's unrelated to any other language. It's as distant from the languages of their neighbors as English is from Chinese. It has nothing in common, apart from a few borrowed words, with the languages of their neighbors. It's a language isolate. It's like the only language, there's only one language isolate in Europe. Do you know what that is?
Basque.
Basque, that's right. It's the only language which is not related to any other language in Europe. And so we have this odd situation that here was a language with click consonants, and I'll have more to say about this in a moment, which is not related to any other language. There was a thought at one time that it was related to click languages in southern Africa. That's not so. We have good data which shows that there is no demonstrable relationship at all with southern African languages. But I can tell you more about that. I mean, there's been really high quality data gathered by two linguists in recent years, neither of whom speaks Hadza, but both of whom did good systematic work through interpreters on the language, more detailed work. I've done detailed work, but they've done, as trained linguists, which I'm not, they've done work on the language and have done detailed comparisons with the extensive published material on languages, on click languages in southern Africa, and there is no demonstrable relationship. Now, of course, as techniques in linguistics improve, it is conceivable that some distance link may in the future emerge, but there's no sign of it yet, and the techniques that are used today are really pretty sophisticated and no linkage. So what we have is a group of people living by hunting and gathering right in the Rift Valley, and it has turned out in an area where we now know, we didn't at that time know, but where we now know was a crucial area for the development of Homo sapiens in form. So, the Hadza are a kind of unique. There are other hunter-gatherers in the Rift Valley, and the Hadza are the only people who are kind of demonstrably there for a long while. The other people in the Rift Valley, in Tanzania and elsewhere, speak languages which are related to other languages, which have demonstrable links with other parts of Africa. The Hadza have links only with their own area, and they're very widely regarded by their neighbors as being there before they arrived in the area. So they're recognized as having chronological precedent, as being there for a long while. And now it's interesting because in recent years, the Hadza were always a very stigmatized group, always regarded as gross inferiors by their neighbors. And I shall have more to say about the incredibly unpleasant racist terminology that was applied to them by their African neighbors, by their immediate neighbors, who referred to them as baboons and used other grossly offensive language about them, and treated them as gross inferiors in a whole range of ways. I've written a paper which no doubt Chris will have a reference to, on discrimination against hunter-gatherers in Africa. It's very widespread, the fact that they're regarded by other Africans as gross inferiors. This idea that discrimination is something just that is done by Europeans to Africans is absurd. Discrimination is a universal human disease, and it's applied not just by Europeans to Africans, but by Africans to other Africans, and by Asians to other Asians. It's a universal human disease and needs to be fought everywhere, and not just linked with differences in colour.
James, I was just wondering if people have just come in, do you want to perhaps move over here, bring your chair over here, be a bit nearer so we can hear? Because everyone bunches up over there, you might be out of earshot, no? Okay, sorry, Jim.
So that's how I got into living with the Hadza. I've talked before, as I've said, about the unexpected and extraordinary way that my research proceeded at that time, and I'm not going to talk about this now unless any of you are keen that I should do so. I'm going to switch now to making some general points about hunter-gatherers and the hunting and gathering way of life. Now, let me start by making some general points which have really emerged, particularly since the 1965 conference on Man the Hunter, but more particularly since then. And certainly I made some contribution towards the development of these points. Now, firstly, hunting and gathering is usually, not always, a relatively easy way of life. It's just that we had this kind of awful notion of progress in way of life, and so we had to make early people, they would have a terribly hard way of life. It would be terribly difficult. It would be a struggle for survival. And if you read much of the early material on hunter-gatherers, it talks about their endless struggle to get enough food to live on. They didn't have any time, it was thought, to really do anything much else. They would be out desperately from dawn to dusk, trying to get just enough to feed themselves. It's not like that. And there will have been a few places where no doubt it was like that, and there are cases where the way of life was not easy. But mostly that's because the more productive land has been grabbed by the politically more powerful agricultural and pastoral groups. But now, even in the marginal lands which hunter-gatherers have occupied in recent generations, there's lots of food. The Hadza, when I was working there between 1957 and 1960, spent far more time gambling for arrows than they did hunting and gathering. That was the way they liked to spend their time. And it was very much a concern of them. It was also very important in influencing their nomadic movements. People would constantly be moving to where the gambling was better. So this idea, which again you get a lot of in the literature, the ecological determinism, by which people, you say, they moved, they were nomadic because they had to be, because they had to move to get more food and to get water, and because their food had run out. Now, I kind of accepted this when I first went there. I thought, yes, that'll be it. That'll be the reason why they moved. They're moving to get access to food and water. Now, I was perplexed because I quite soon saw that one group would move out of some location, and then a few days later, some other group would move into that same place. And, it simply wasn't the case that people moved only for that reason, or even primarily for that reason. It was always a factor. People, when they moved, always liked to move, obviously, to where the food was easier to get. But there were all sorts of other factors that came into it, as I've said. One of them was, where was the good gambling going on? The other thing was what religious activities were going on elsewhere. And then there were things like, what about social life more generally, where young men would be moving to look for attractive young women. Young women would be moving to look for attractive young men. Children would be moving, and children moved a lot independently. From the age of about 6 or 7 or 8, they acted very independently, and they'd be moving off to where there were cohorts of children with which they liked to associate. There was lots of freedom of movement, and people moved for all sorts of reasons, and not just to improve access to food and water, although of course it was good to move to somewhere where getting food was easier. And it's a bit, people often, if you ask them why they moved, they often would give an explanation in ecological terms. They often would say, oh, we moved there because the berries are ripened there, or so on. Now, the advantage of this explanation is it's nice and neutral. It doesn't have any kind of worrying connotations. If you, on the other hand, you say, I moved there because I was having a row with my neighbor in the camp and I wanted to get away from him, that has implications. Now, think about our own society. If you're living at home as a young person and going to university, but the relationships are getting a bit difficult with your parents, and you want to move, and you really want to live a bit more of an independent way of life. What are you going to say? You're going to say, oh, it's become a bit inconvenient, really, to travel, to commute from the university. I really ought to live closer to the university. You won't say it's because, you're unlike to say it's because, our relations are a bit strained and I want to be a bit more independent. You're most unlikely to say that. You're likely to give an ecological reason because it's nice and neutral. It's not, the best way of dealing with social problems is not to acknowledge that they exist. It's not to mention them. And that often does get over the immediate difficulty. And so ecological difficulties have this lovely neutral side to them. And that's really why interviewing is not an adequate way of finding out about a society. You can find out things by interviewing, but you tend to get the easy answer and not the one that is a bit fraught with emotion and that is a bit difficult and that people may not even be very willing to acknowledge to themselves, let alone to others. And that's why observation is critical. Observation is what matters. If we want to understand human behavior, we have to observe. Now, I'm also going to make a claim that is a bit more controversial because not everybody who works with the Hadza or with other hunter-gatherers speaks their language. What I'm going to claim as a speaker of their language is that this is very important because what is the best way of finding out about what people's concerns are is to sit and watch and listen. Now, I'm not able to listen so well now because old age has stolen my hearing and made life, in that respect, more difficult. I can hear when I'm talking direct to somebody, but I have a lot of difficulty with picking up conversation. And that's one of the sad things about visiting the Hadza now, is that I can't do what I used to be able to do, and that's to listen in, to hear what people are talking about, and to gather from these what their immediate concerns are. And that's so diagnostic of social life, of what people are really bothered about. And I mean, you get all, you'll know from the way that interviews work in this country how inadequate they are for really discovering what's going on. I mean, interviews about sexuality are notoriously inefficient because people love to either pretend that they have a far more active sex life than in fact they do, or else are reluctant to talk about the subject at all. But it's not just sensitive subjects like sexuality which yield very poor results, but it's many other subjects too. I mean, people are really pretty reluctant to acknowledge really how they're likely to vote. That's why public opinion surveys are very often not very reliable. I mean, it's not really until you get exit polls of how people have just voted that you begin to get results that are moderately accurate. But anyway, that's so interviewing, which some anthropologists still depend on heavily, is not a substitute for actually speaking the language. Now, hunting and gathering is usually a relatively easy way of life. It's not normally a struggle for existence in which all one's waking hours are spent in a relentless search for food and water and other basic requirements. Even in marginal environments in which people have survived into recent times, people enjoy long hours of leisure in which they can express and elaborate their cultures. And I talked about how the Hadza spent more time, the pleasure of pursuit of gambling for arrows than they did on hunting. Australian Aboriginal people spent massive amounts of time expressing and elaborating their really wonderfully elaborate religious and ritual concerns. I mean, the one thing that is really striking about Australian Aboriginal societies that we do have a lot of data on is when they had this marvelous art and wonderfully elaborate rituals and religious practice. And you couldn't do that if really you were too busy obtaining your food all the time. They spent an awful lot of their time on elaborating their own culture. Now, secondly, so hunting and gathering usually a relatively easy way of life, and in fact rather easier, I think, than the agriculture which followed, but I can talk about why that is so more if you're interested. Hunting and gathering is usually also a healthy way of life, in which people are generally well nourished. Again, I can give a Hadza example. A rather detailed study by pediatricians and that is by child medical specialists of the nutritional status of the Hadza in the 1960s, in which I participated as an interpreter and as an interviewer, showed that their nutritional status was exceptionally good in comparison with other East Africans. Now, these pediatricians had done studies of rural crop growers, rural pastoralists, and also of urban populations of Africans. And their conclusion was that the Hadza were the best group of children that they'd seen anywhere in East Africa, Hadza children. And they examined an awful lot of Hadza children. We examined hundreds of Hadza children, and it was a very detailed study. And it's not, in a way, really very surprising, because the Hadza were living on a very wide range of foods. They were getting meat, but meat was only a minority in terms of calorific intake. Meat gave them fewer calories than they got from the vegetable foods that they consumed. People were living on meat, on roots, on berries, on fruit, and on honey, all of which came from indigenous sources, from plants and animals that are well adapted to the local habitat and didn't fail if you got an unusually dry season or an unusually wet season. There was always something that was still around. Now, the problem with cultivated foods is that they fail because they're not indigenous. they fail from time to time. You know, maize in the area where I was would fail, well, maybe 1 year in 5, sometimes 2 years in 5, you'll get no crop. And there would be famine. People would actually be starving. Children would be suffering from kwashiorkor, another serious malnutrition. But of course, it's because cultivators typically rely just on a very small range of foods. And actually, the move to maize from the various kinds of millet and sorghum that people used to rely on, people came to rely on maize because it involves much less labor, but it's more vulnerable to drought than millet and sorghum is. The problem with these various kinds of millet, which are more nutritious than maize, the problem with them is that they're eaten by birds, and you get massive flocks of birds come and eat them. And unless you have really good access to lots of child labor, to lots of children to throw stones at the birds and chase them off, you don't get much of a harvest. And as children increasingly were going to school, they weren't available to chase the birds off. And that was one of the factors that has led to an ever-increasing switch to maize in Africa, and actually an ever-increasing susceptibility to famine. Education, very valuable and very important for all sorts of reasons, has reduced the availability of children as bird scarers. There are other factors too, but that's an important one. Now, it's interesting that what happened with the first development of cattle keeping and agriculture is that it's linked with a marked decline in nutrition. We now know from skeletal material that there was more malnutrition after people started to domesticate animals and to cultivate. Now, why on earth, given that situation, did people start to cultivate and keep domesticated animals? The reason is relatively straightforward, I believe. I think the fundamental reason is the military advantage that you get if you can concentrate your foods. If you can get your foods all in a narrow space, and you then can mobilize groups of people effectively to attack your neighbors and steal their land. So agriculture and pastoralism both gave military advantages. And the other thing is, in order to, once you've got crops and once you've got cattle, you need to have effective military organization, because you need to be able to protect the crops that you've harvested and the cattle that you've accumulated. It's no use having cattle if you can't defend them. You've got to be able to defend them against outsiders, and you've got to have military organization to do that. If you're hunter-gatherers, the obvious solution, if you're attacked, is to disperse. You run away and hide. Why do anything else? You don't have any accumulated crops or domesticated animals to protect. And it's much the best solution. I mean, it's far more sensible than attacking your neighbors. I mean, if you attack your neighbors, you might get killed. So on the whole, hunter-gatherers, not all hunter-gatherers, because some had organizations which was rather similar. Many had organizations rather similar to the organization of people with agriculture, people with cattle. But those who didn't, those who lived like the Hadza, with what I call an immediate return system of social organization, and I can explain that for any of you who don't already understand it, if you like. Those who have an organization like the Hadza, there is absolutely no point in standing up against your neighbours, much the best thing to do is just simply to try to avoid them. I think I'll say one or two more points and then we can have a break. This business of health can be generalized. I've said the skeletal material now, which shows, and there are others who know far more about this material than I do, but it is now fairly generally recognized by experts on skeletal material that there was generally, not always, a marked decline in nutrition as far as that can be discerned from skeletal material, and at the time of the Neolithic Revolution. There's also some interesting new material in an article which has just been published. There's a new article published just in the last few weeks called, this curious vocabulary, a new article called Gracility of the Modern Homo sapiens Skeleton is the result of decreased biomechanical loading. Now, this has just been published in the past few weeks in PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the USA. The authors, who are medical doctors, argue from detailed analyses of skeletal material, rather few samples actually, but especially the hip joint, which is one of the most vulnerable points of the human skeleton, that hunter-gatherers had significantly more robust bone strength than sedentary agriculturalists because of the nature of their physical activity. The kind of physical activity that hunter-gatherers are involved in, the lots of walking and some running and moving, carrying loads that they carry when they carry game meat back to camp, all of this physical activity, and increased their bone strength. Now, we don't have adequate sample material yet, but if this turns out to be true, it's important because actually breaking the femur and the hip is an important cause of early death. It's linked. I mean, the one thing that when you get to my age, you mustn't do is to break your bones, because it increases the risk of mortality, particularly if you break the femur. And the hip joint is, of course, very vulnerable. And you know how, until people were able to do replacement hips, it was a terribly serious cause of incapacity in old age. Now, whether the kind of relative importance of nutrition and the relative importance of exercise in among hunter-gatherers is something that obviously the biologists are likely to investigate more. But it's likely that both factors are in some way relevant. Good nutrition, good exercise were beneficial, and probably the lifespan of hunter-gatherers was longer than the lifespan once people started to live by agriculture and pastoralism. Now, what about the danger from hunting accidents? What about the danger from lions and leopards and in East Africa from African buffaloes? Now, I collected more than 400 genealogies of Hadza, and I asked, wherever there were people in the genealogies who had died, I asked about the cause of death. The number of people who had died from being killed by wild animals was tiny, hardly anybody. There were people who'd been badly injured, but when attacked by leopards, and people who had been injured when knocked over by buffaloes and indeed by rhinos. But being killed was very rare. People were skilled. I mean, they knew what was safe and what wasn't safe. And the Hadza regularly take meat from a lion's kill. They see a lion that has killed a zebra or something, and the Hadza then take up position, maybe 50 yards away, and watch what's going on. And when they reckon that the lions or the lion or lions have had their fill, have had a reasonable amount to eat, they drive them off the kill. They chase them away, but they don't do that until it's the right moment. Women, even women on their own, not armed with bows and arrows, armed only with digging sticks, will chase lions off their kill and take the meat. It's it's entirely possible to do it now. How do they spot lion kills? In the old days, when there were many vultures in the area, they would be watching all the time for the movements of vultures in the sky. And if you see one vulture flying in a particular direction, it doesn't mean anything much. Once two vultures are flying in the same direction, it means a bit more. People start paying attention. When it's 3 or 4, you get up and you walk in that same direction. Because vultures, many of which are operating at very high altitude, spot kills, have amazing skill in spotting kills. And the Hadza are obtaining a lot of their food by scavenging the food from lions, from the kills of lions and leopards. And so in spite of driving lions off their kill, it's not a significant cause of death. Interestingly, snake bite is a significant cause of death. I mean, and one of the reasons for this among the Hadza is that they hunt hyrax, that is, little animals that live among the rocks about the size of a rabbit. And if you shoot one of these with an arrow, they plunge into holes in the rocks. And what the Hadza do is, I mean, obviously they're not going to just not get it because it's in a hole in the rock. They'll put their hand in the rock and try and fish it out. And unfortunately, there are also snakes which live in these holes in the rocks, and they do sometimes get bitten. And if you're bitten by some of the poisonous snakes in Hadza country, you don't survive. And actually, I'm sure some of the cases of death are not actually caused by the snake, but the Hadza believe, as doctors in this country used to believe, that the only remedy for something as bad as a snake bite is to use some powerful medicine. And so in some cases, people rubbed arrow poison into the wound on the grounds that this would counter the snake bite poison. And of course, just as in European medicine, you'll see that people, again, use powerful poisons to counteract diseases in the 19th century. The Hadza have the same idea, and so do some other people. They treat a powerful danger with a powerful remedy. And I'm sure that some of the cases of death that the arrow poison contributed to, or even caused the death of the person. Now, my third and final background point is a rather different one. Now, I think I've already said enough about that one. That's yes. No. Anyway, so I just want to leave you with the general point that hunting and gathering is a nice way of life. Why do you think I wanted to stay on when I spent 3 years there? It's because it's a good way of life, an attractive way of life. Why do you think I've been visiting constantly over the years? It's because I like it there, and because I enjoy it, and because I like the people there, because it's a good area. And now I'll continue after we've had a break. Let's have a break now. Just before I start, I was talking during the break about cycling, which is another of my enthusiasms. I cycle everywhere, and I strongly recommend it as an activity for the elderly. I mean, I'm very unstable when I walk now because my legs are rickety, but curiously, I get on my bike and I return to normality. I mean, on a bike, it's curious. The balance is quite different. And on a bike, I'm not, I really am not at all unstable. And the only time I become unstable is if I've got to stop the damn thing and put my foot down. But no, it's splendid. And
where have you cycled from tonight? Have you cycled
I'm not far, just from King's Cross. I cycled to the station in Cambridge, put my bike on the train, and then cycled from King's Cross, so no distance at all. In Cambridge, I cycle only a mile or two. But no, just as before I start, I've got an ambition, which I will have told many times before, but let me tell you all my ambition. And that is, my ambition is, I'm now in my 80s, but my ambition is that when I'm 100, I'm going to cycle 100 miles. But there's an interesting thing. It was announced recently in the paper that a Frenchman had, on his 100th birthday, had cycled 100 miles around a circuit, all in one go. I'm going to cheat. I'm not going to cycle 100 miles in one go. I shall do it in a series of smaller goes. But anyway, there's my ambition.
But in Hadza country, James. In Hadza country.
You can, when I accomplish it, you can invite me again. There we are. Now, anyway, what did I do? I said I would talk about what I do in Tanzania these days. I go repeatedly to the Hadza. I was there for a couple of months this last year and came back in December. I now plan to go again in April or thereabouts. The plan is to go again. And what do I do? Now, first a little bit about Tanzania in general, rather than about the Hadza. Tanzania is an excellent place to visit. I mean, it's relatively stable. Since independence, you don't see much about Tanzania because it is relatively stable. Wretched papers like the Daily Telegraph only publish negative things about Africa and not the positive ones. And Tanzania is a splendid place to go to. And I strongly recommend it. There have been, in the past, terrorist outrages, but very few. And Kenya, on the other hand, has many. And it's difficult to recommend Kenya at the moment because it is a place of political uncertainty, and it is a place where the senior members of government are themselves involved in some pretty nasty activities, to say the least, and ruthless action against their opponents. Tanzania, that is not the case. The officials retire when they're supposed to retire. The presidents go when they're supposed to go, and it's good for that reason. There are problems, and let me mention one of them. And the country is, the literate part of the people is roughly evenly divided between Muslims and Christians. And that's a potentially rather explosive situation. But very fortunately, the political parties, the major political parties, include members of both religions. The political parties are not based on religious affiliation. And Nyerere was determined that that's what would happen, that religion was not going to enter into the formation of political groupings. And it seems to me that that's been immensely valuable. But at the same time, being a kind of 50-50 country is potentially dangerous, and things that are happening outside could influence the situation. And interestingly, we hear a lot about the hatred expressed by Muslims these days, but my experience has been of hatred expressed by Christian groups in Tanzania against Muslims. I've seen myself speeches by Christian preachers denouncing Muslims as devil worshippers and as evil. And it's terrible that many of these groups are financed by money coming from, in particular, Scandinavia and from the United States. It is not the case in Tanzania that the hatred is coming from one side and not the other. Sadly, it exists on both sides, and I have seen particularly terrible, terrible things said by Christians against Muslims. Quite appalling things. But at any rate, the position, in spite of that, is politically that's not articulated at the moment, thank goodness. And politically, the country is relatively stable, and terrorist outrages which have happened in Kenya have not happened in recent times in Tanzania. It's stable at the moment, it's a good country to visit, and if you want to see Africa, go to Tanzania. It's a good place to go. Now, so a bit more about the Tanzanian background. I get off the plane and I really enjoy the fact that I enter another world. I'm reasonably fluent in day-to-day Swahili, and once I get off the plane, I'm talking in the local lingua franca rather than English. And I've got 4 daughters, and one of my daughters is also fluent in Swahili, and she and I have rented a house in the nearest city to the Hadza, and it's a lovely house because what it is it's a little place in an African compound. A Maasai man who owns 2 or 3 taxis has got his compound of his own, and he's decided he's very much an entrepreneur. He's decided to build a house on this land, and we've contributed to the building of it, and we have rented it. And what is really lovely about it is that in this little area of land, which is in Arusha, the nearest city to the Hadza, there are store-fed cattle which he has on the land. There are lots of African children running around, lots of chickens running around, and I'm not isolated. I can chat to the children all day, and it's lovely. It's part of the community, which is difficult to be when I'm there rather than out with the Hadza. So that's part of what I do in Tanzania. And that's where I store my ancient Land Rover, which I bought in 1967, and which goes wrong rather frequently, but where I know every nut and bolt on it. And so when it goes wrong, I can usually fix it. You don't need a computer. What you do need are mountains of spare parts, which I have in the back of the car. So it's all laden down with all this metal, all these bits and pieces which might go wrong. And every time I go out to Africa, I go out with yet more spare parts for it. So anyway, it'll see me out, and that's what matters. And now when I go to Africa, because I find driving for more than about 2 hours and difficult, I get weary doing it. The Land Rover has very heavy steering and very heavy braking, but I employ an African driver to help me. Now, sadly, there isn't one of the Hadza, not one of the members of this hunting and gathering group who can drive yet. And so what I have at the moment, and what the driver whom I use at the moment, is the next best thing. He's actually married to a Hadza. He has a Hadza wife. Although he doesn't speak the language, he, at any rate, does know quite a bit about the Hadza and doesn't scorn them. The big problem with employing somebody who is not a Hadza is that typically they're immensely patronizing about them and say to them, oh, you ought to live as Tanzanians, and living as a hunter-gatherer is not living as a Tanzanian. So it's a problem, but it is valuable to have somebody who can help me with the driving and help with putting up my tent and that kind of thing. Anyway, there are massive changes in Tanzania since I first went there. There are curious things and unexpected things. One of them is that there are far more Europeans in Tanzania now than there ever were during the period when it was administered by Britain. Far more. And the difference is that in those days, in the old days when it was administered by Britain, the majority of the Europeans who were there then could speak Swahili, could speak the national language. Now, very few of them do. I mean, what you have is an endless procession of NGO people who are there for a couple of years, who typically don't learn the language properly, and who then depart. And so lots and lots of Europeans, but not many of them who know very much about the country. Now, if you look back at the period of when the country was administered by Britain, as I see it, there were two kinds of administrators. There were the terrible old army people, with whom I had some terrible experiences actually, who basically saw their role as maintaining law and order, who really thought that their job as administrators was to keep people, to keep control, and to make sure that there weren't riots or trouble of that sort, and to maintain the route from the Cape to Cairo, from the extremes of South Africa right up to the north, to keep it trouble-free as they saw it. Now, fortunately, those people were, as independence grew closer, those people were declining in numbers, and increasingly the administrators were basically what I would describe as Oxfam types, as people who saw their role as being to promote African education, to create cattle dips, to make, to improve grazing, and basically to administer the country effectively, to build roads, to improve communications, and to promote that kind of development. And I had a real problem at one stage in my own research because I got ill in the field. I got a nasty condition called pericarditis, which is infection of the heart lining, and had to go to hospital for a long while, actually, for nearly 2 months. But I was the local administrator, who was a terrible old army type, told me that I couldn't return to do field research because of self-neglect. he said I got ill because I'd neglected myself. And it was only after I had to produce all sorts of doctors' letters and evidence that my illness was absolutely nothing to do with self-neglect, that I was able to stay on. But I mean, he didn't want anybody dying on his patch, was his view. But anyway, so he wanted everything nice and tidy, and I was untidy. And so that's what happened. Anyway, that I resented that bitterly, but fortunately he was succeeded by a man for whom I had the greatest respect, and who actually did subsequently, after he left Tanzania, when it became independent, he then did work actually for Oxfam for the next 20 years. And what was interesting about him was he knew Nyerere well personally, and Nyerere, when he visited Oxfam in Oxford, used to, he on principle walked up the stairs rather than taking the lift because he believed that it was good. And Nyerere would walk with him up the stairs, which I always thought was splendid. The advisors of Nyerere's advisors all went up in the lift. Anyway, so that's just a bit of a digression. Now, in Tanzania, there have been massive changes in recent years. Roads, buildings, communications, education, medicine, and prices. I mean, it's been very difficult for the poor. Really, really difficult. There is increasing inequality in the country, and there are wealthy Africans and there are impoverished Africans. The wealthy are often called Wabenzi, the people with Mercedes Benzes, and are scorned by ordinary people. And there is a very marked difference, and it's really very worrying to see the members of Parliament recently gave themselves a whacking great increase in pay, and basically they feel that, you know, in the modern world they ought to be paid the same as members of Parliament are paid in Europe and the rest of the world, and this is offensive in a country in which the ordinary wage of the ordinary person, the night watchman, the street sweeper, and people like that is basically £1 a day, the equivalent to £1 a day. It's offensive, but that is what is happening. Those who have senior positions, even in a country as responsible as Tanzania, and it is relatively responsible in African terms, the people who hold power do award themselves, do consider themselves, understandably, as wanting to be the equivalent of people in other countries and paying themselves an equivalent amount. Anyway, there's been a big row about this recently, and the opposition in Tanzania, there is a strong opposition, has denounced the people from awarding themselves this amount of money, and has said that the money really ought to have gone, as it should have done, in my view, into education, and that people ought to be judging their salaries not in relation to the rest of the world, but in relation to the rest of the population of the country.
James, how are you thinking of running the next half hour? Because we've got half an hour left now.
Right, okay, well, I will say a bit about what I was doing, which is what I said.
Please do, and also I'm sure everyone's bursting to ask you questions about the
You're
Hadza.
quite right, Chris, you're absolutely right to get me focused. So lots of inequality, lots of deforestation, lots of soil erosion, lots of changes in the flow of rivers, where increasingly the flow is being diverted into irrigation projects which favour multinationals who are developing crops like sugarcane, but also favour the local wealthy elite who in many cases own these plantations.
Sorry, James, just a quick question. What do the NGOs have anything to do with any of this going on? Is there a connection between because I know the NGOs are big in East Africa. This is where they're located.
The NGOs differ enormously, as you would expect. Some NGOs are actually promoting what I would regard as highly negative development, but many are not. Many are working against that, and they're very varied indeed. And my own daughter runs her own NGO, which you can ask me about later, because I've got to get on.
Yes, please. We're running out of time.
Yes. There are massive changes in land use, a massive switch to marketable crops, to things which are sold, to onions, wheat, fruits, but also things that are marketed internationally, like coffee and tea. There's a big growth in these, and sugar cane to grow sugar, which is sold internationally. There's a lot of land grabbing and land enclosure. You get the powerful African groups grabbing land from those that are weaker. The Hadza have lost 90% of their land, 90% of it to the neighboring, more powerful African grouping. And there are many other groups that are politically weak that have lost a lot of land. What you need is educated people to defend in the courts if necessary, but to defend in the various forums where these matters are discussed, to defend rights to land. And one of the real priorities of Hadza is to get educated people who will defend their land rights. Now, what's happening about the Hadza, and what am I doing these days when I go out there? The current situation of the Hadza is that there's, in this small amount of land that remains, 10% of the land that they had when I was there in the 1950s, roughly. It's the heartland of their country. It's actually the key component of what they used to have. It's a very important area. There's been a great game decline. The rhino has disappeared altogether. There's a great decline in the number of elephants and most other game. Vultures have disappeared almost totally. Rhino have gone completely. They were very abundant when I was first there. There have been huge incursions, seasonal incursions by pastoralists, pastoralists displaced by neighboring agriculturalists go to the only area where people are politically weaker than they are, and they come and use their land. So you get these vast herds of cattle moving into their country at the peak dry season. And the problem is that they dig out the water sources, the water holes, and so the game has great difficulty in getting, game animals have great difficulty in getting water. Now, it's a serious situation, but it's gradually, a permanent occupation by these pastoralists has now been displaced from the key Hadza area. And the key thing is to see whether this seasonal movement of cattle in the area can be moved to other areas. The problem is where on earth these people can go to, because their land, they have moved because their land has been grabbed. It's a very difficult issue. Now, there are big changes in Hadza personnel too. What has happened in recent years is that increasingly, when I first went there, there were some Hadza who had mixed with a neighboring cultivating tribe and were a mixed group of, and I call them the cultivating Hadza. They'd mixed with people called the Isanzu, and mostly it was a case of there being Isanzu men who had married Hadza women. It was mostly one-way marriage, just women of the hunter-gatherer group being taken by the men in this neighboring cultivating group, and they formed communities of cultivating Hadza. Now, what has happened is increasingly the cultivating Hadza have been basically moving into the bush and colonizing the area used by the Hadza. So they're much more of a mixed community than they used to be. And that's an important change. There's also a change in food obtaining, in the way that people obtain food. These cultivating Hadza, they do some cultivation in what used to be wholly bush areas now. There's some cultivation going on, but there's still a lot of hunting going on. And there are some people who are living, a proportion of people are living wholly by hunting and gathering. There's a change in ritual. It's all rather curious. The key ritual is a ritual held at night every month when there's no moon. And Chris has an awful lot to say about the significance of it, as you can imagine, because it's monthly and is tied in with a whole lot of other monthly occurrences. It's this ritual, which is absolutely fundamental for the Hadza, is held now less than it used to be. It was absolutely obligatory. There was no avoiding it. Everybody in a nomadic camp had to attend, and there would be likely to be, it's probable that there would be violence if people didn't attend it. It was regarded as very important. And now, ostrich are extinct in Hadza country, sadly. And an essential component of this ritual that they perform is an ostrich feather headdress. Now, there are still a few ostrich feather headdresses around, but many others have worn out, and people don't feel that they can hold the ritual properly without ostrich feathers. Now, some ostrich feathers have been obtained from elsewhere. There are now a few Hadza who work in neighbouring game reserves and who are able to get ostrich feathers there. And there have been other ways in which they get ostrich feathers, and I shall try and take some from the ostrich farms that exist in this country, because it's really important that they have this. But anyway, it's one of the factors, but there are other factors which have led to a decline in this, what used to be, and what remains for many people, an absolutely key ritual event. Now, tourism. There are lots and lots of tourists who now visit the Hadza, one particular area. What they want to see is Hadza actually hunting animals. And what happens is tourists come basically for a day. They go out early in the morning with Hadza, and the Hadza men who take them out shoot something. It may be a bird or a small antelope, but something. The aim is the Hadza are able to demonstrate their very skilled archery and are able to talk a bit about the foods that they eat in the bush and that kind of thing. But it's become extraordinary. There are hundreds of tourists come. This is just one particular corner of Hadza country. Now, they're even building lodges where the tourists can stay. It's and the tourists pay a lot of money for this, but of course most of the money goes to the lodges and to the non-Hadza who organize these visits. But it's become a significant factor in Hadza life. Now, some Hadza really welcome this, and it does provide a source of income and a means by which Hadza can take advantage of some of the undoubted interests that they now have. Interests in when I first went there, many people didn't even know what country they lived in. But now, they're aware not just of the country, but also of some of the politics of the country, and also of some of the links of Tanzania with the rest of the world. In fact, I have on many occasions welcomed Hadza to my house in this country, and there are Hadza who travelled and who know a lot more about the world than you might expect. But at any rate, they one of the negative effects of tourism is that in that area there's now an awful lot of alcoholism among the Hadza, and there's also a lot of prostitution and significant amount of HIV/AIDS. So it's an unpleasant situation.
Is this around Arusha?
Sorry?
Is this around Arusha?
No, it's well away from Arusha.
What is it called?
It's if you go on the route to Ngorongoro, you turn off that route down to Mangola, and that's where the tourism is. It's just on the edge of Hadza country, and fortunately, most of Hadza country is as yet very little affected by tourism. But it's just that particular corner, and many people, you go there en route to see the game animals of Ngorongoro and the Serengeti. And, if I were going there, I might well go as a tourist, because, it does give you a glimpse of a way of life. It's not at all a satisfactory glimpse, but it is a glimpse. And it is interesting, actually, that now the situation is a bit more positive than it used to be, for two reasons. Some Hadza are now conscious that if they're drunk when they go out hunting, that will be very unpopular with the tourists. And so, there is a limitation to the alcoholism, and there's some restriction now on the amount of alcohol consumption in the area. But still, an awful lot of the money does go into locally produced spirits. Now, social changes. Status of the Hadza. Now, the Hadza are bringing money into the area. People aren't going to visit the neighbouring tribal groups because they're not seen as interesting, with one exception. But in general, they're not. But the Hadza are bringing money into the area, and their stigmatization, the fact that they were elaborately discriminated against, is certainly reducing, because they're bringing money into the area. And they're perceived now as being something of an asset, a curious asset, but something of an asset. And now their traditional organization was based very much on egalitarianism among the Hadza and on sharing. There is now less sharing than there used to be. It's in decline, and one of the reasons for this is money. In the past, people didn't have money. When I first went there, people wouldn't have anything apart from a few coins. They didn't have money. But now everybody has money, and of course everybody wants money. Now, money is easily concealed, and it's not easy to enforce. When somebody earns some money by showing around tourists, it's very difficult to compel them to share it. Whereas if they bring in meat, it's visible, and it's quite easy to enforce sharing. And so sharing is in decline partly as a result of this. Education is crucial if they're going to retain their land. And I've always believed that it really is important that some Hadza should be well educated so that they can compete effectively in the forums which decide on matters like land allocation and on other crucial political matters like that. Now, this year, for the first time, we've got 2 Hadza who are at university. It's the first time. And one of them is training as a lawyer in a local university, not in a major university, but in a local one. And we'll see how that works out. I hope it'll work out really well. He seems to be doing fine at the moment. The other case is even more remarkable. The second person who's at university is a woman, and she is at the most prestigious university in the country, the University of Dar es Salaam, and of all subjects, she's studying engineering. It's just amazing, you know. There aren't any. I mean, there are no feats of engineering in Hadza country. There aren't any real roads in Hadza country. There's a road down to the place where tourists go, but it's not tarmacked or anything. It's just a rough, stony road. There's, I think, one bridge only in the whole of Hadza country, and that's on that road. I just hope that she's not lost to the Hadza. She may well be lost to them and marry some outsider and go off and do splendid engineering projects in other parts of the country. But I hope not. I hope she will act. And the young man who's in the local university, will act on behalf of the Hadza. That's what we need, a spokesman for the Hadza, people prepared to be effective spokesmen. Now, what do I do when I go out there? Which is what I came to talk about today. I'm going to just mention very briefly what I do, what I did last year and what I do now.
Leave some time for questions as well, James.
Yes, I can cover this in questions. What I do when I'm there is, the main thing is, I do the self-indulgent thing of having lots of lovely conversations in Swahili and in Hadza. I'm fluent in both. Nowadays, most Hadza know a lot of Swahili, and actually, when talking to the Hadza, we're constantly jumping from one language to the other. I'm fluent in both. I don't mind if there's a break in mid-sentence and you switch to the other language. It really depends particularly on the topic. If you're talking about hunting, of course, you talk in Hadza. If you're talking about politics or education, you talk in Swahili. And Africans are splendidly uninhibited about switching languages. I mean, we have all this ridiculous nonsense that, you know, if you're having a conversation with somebody in France, you're supposed to talk in either French or in English. It's ridiculous. Very often it's going to be best if the Frenchman talks in French and you talk in English if you can understand a fair amount of the other language, or if you switch in mid-sentence, if you can both understand a bit of the other languages. We have this ridiculous notion that you shouldn't jump around. The important thing is communication, and you've just got to get on with it. And mixing languages is splendid. It works well, and it's the best way of communicating. And I enjoy doing it, and so do the Hadza, and that's how we operate. And my Swahili is not the rarefied sort that you get on the coast of Tanzania. My Swahili is the sort you get in the markets in the country, on the buses, and among ordinary people. And at that level, I'm fluent and can talk in it as easily as I'm talking to you now. It's not a problem. And in Hadza, it's curious, but I'm a bit less fluent in Hadza than I am in Swahili, but that's because I mind if I get it wrong. In Swahili, I don't mind if I make mistakes. In Hadza, I like to get it grammatically correct. And that's because, you know, that was the focus for my research. And that's an obstacle. For communication, it's best not to mind too much. But anyway, that's a diversion. I can tell you a bit about the language if you want to know in the questions. There are obstacles to learning the language. Now, one of the main things I'm doing now is I'm preparing material so that those who want to learn it, and there aren't any other Europeans who speak it yet. There have been lots of researchers among the Hadza, but nobody has, apart from me, speaks the language. And what I'm doing is preparing a kind of simple document that will help in this process of learning it. Disgracefully, I've only published one thing on Hadza in all the
Yeah,
years.
disgracefully.
I ought to have published much more. Anyway, then another thing that I do when I go out there, and so that's one of my projects. One of the things I'm doing is preparing this material, and it's important that I do so because, in particular, there's a friend of mine in Tanzania, an American actually, but who was born in Tanzania and has lived all his life in Tanzania, who is totally fluent in Swahili, but who would like to learn Hadza, and I'm helping him to learn it, and I want to prepare a document that will make it easier for him and for others. Now, the next thing I do is that I'm doing as much as I can of is teaching the Hadza to write their own language. Now, there are many Hadza now who've been to school who can read and write Swahili. But how do you, if you want to write Hadza, there are problems. If you want to say a word like punkukunea, how do you write it? Punkukunea. Now, you have to know how you render the clicks and the adjectives. Clicks, the breath is going out, as in punku, punku. No, sorry, I've got this the wrong way around. Punku, the breath is going in when you say the sound. With adjectives, the breath is going out, as in the second half of that word, cool, cool. That's an adjective K. Now, so you get both clicks and adjectives, and sometimes in the same word, as in that example. Another example would be ka-ka-tambo, ka-ka-tambo. Now they've got two clicks there followed by an adjective. In that case, they've got two lateral clicks made at the side of the mouth, ka-ka, and then followed by a tambo, where the breath is going out, which is an adjective TL, an adjective lateral. Now, one of the big difficulties with the language initially that I had was distinguishing these sounds. Now it seems to me entirely obvious that the difference between ka and ka is, but to hear that difference when you're not accustomed to it is not easy. In one, the breath is going in, ka. In the other, the breath is going out, ka. And they're to the Hadza, they're completely different, and if you get that wrong, they don't understand what you're saying. They're not accustomed to hearing the language spoken correctly. And now, how do you write the language? You've got basically 3 clicks. They can be nasalized, they can be aspirated, and you've got, with the adjectives, you've got adjective K, bekau, adjective TL, as in oa. You've got adjective CH, as in charcoal. Adjective, there are, what other adjectives are there? TS, charcoal. So you have a range of adjectives and a range of clicks. Now you cannot render these. You've got to know how to render these if the language is going to be intelligible when read. I want the Hadza to learn to write their own language so that they can communicate with each other, so they can write to their kin, their wives and their husbands, their friends, in a language which is emotionally meaningful to them rather than in an alien language. But also a language which has a measure of privacy with it and isn't a kind of very public language, a language which is one that is meaningful to them. And in order to do that, those who can already write Swahili need to get used to rendering the sounds in Hadza, to rendering them in writing. And I can show them how to do that. And it takes about 4 or 5 days with people who are really interested in doing it. And what happens is you take a group of people 4 or 5 days. Some people learn to do this quite easily. Others have a lot of difficulty. But if you, let me give an illustration in English of what the kind of problem is. Now, in English, one of the unusual sounds in the language is the TH sound. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware of the fact, but there are 2 different THs in English. There's the soft THs and there's the hard TH. The soft TH, the example would be thin, thin. The hard TH would be as in then, the. There's the and there's the. And now, if you were to try to start to write and to write those differently each time, you really have to think each time before you come across the sound. Which is it? Is it the hard TH or the soft TH? Now, just the same, if you teach Hadza how to write clicks, they have to think carefully each time, which one is it? And to be able to write it correctly. Now, one of the ways you distinguish people who are in conversation, we distinguish between those who are English, brought up speaking English, from those who are not, is very often they get the THs not right. And now, unfamiliar, because they're written in the same way in English, we're just not aware of that distinction. And foreigners have particular difficulty over it. Now, you can have some confusions like this. Some in a language, you can have some things that we use a single letter to represent different phonemes, different sounds. But you can't do that with a whole. If you've got a whole lot of distinctions, the language becomes unintelligible. You've got to have it reasonably consistent. So that's why I teach Hadza to write their.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes
I
left.
Okay.
I think it would be best to stop and have some questions. Because
Yeah,
it doesn't mean you can't
Now,
keep talking.
the other thing that I've been doing is I want some questions.
James, we've got 5 minutes, really, because we have to stop at
No, I
9.
want some questions. The other thing that I've done is this last time I was visiting a former hunter-gatherer group in East Africa who lost their language and was working with 2 very elderly people, a man and his sister, and they were conjuring up the language that they had spoken 70 years ago, maybe, something like that, because I want to know what language it was. And this was a very important work because we're dealing literally with a language which is about to go extinct. But now the real pleasure of visiting the Hadza is I'm visiting old friends. I'm visiting people that I've met over years and years. And that's what I like doing. I've finished. That's the end. Questions?
Right, we have 5 minutes for questions.
How many phonemes are there in Hadza language?
How many?
Phonemes, basic
I
sounds.
can't answer that. I would have to count them up, which I can't do now. But quite a lot. But no, I can't answer that. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
How did you learn?
How did I
How did you
learn
go
it?
about learning?
Well, it was agonizing. The biggest problem was that the Hadza, because outsiders don't learn their language because they were a stigmatized group, and the outsiders don't, and even now today, don't learn their language. Other Africans don't learn it. They didn't believe that outsiders could learn their language, and they're not accustomed to hearing it spoken badly. So that made learning the language a very difficult task. And the other particular problem is that there's a construction in Hadza which is called the predicative. And that is that if you, the word for impala is poboko. That's the word for an impala, a kind of antelope. Now, if you point at an impala and say, and try and get the word for impala and to write it down, what they will say is, you point at it and say, what is it? And they'll say, not popoko, they'll say popowako. And what that means is, it is an impala. But the problem, so it's a predicative form. You can't then say popowako, you can't use that in a sentence, the impala is going. You've got to eliminate the predicative element in the word before you can use it in a sentence. And so, but people immediately answer, of course they answer, it is you point to a tree, they'll say, it is a baobab tree, or it is a, whatever it is. You've got the verb to be incorporated in the word. And that is an obstacle at the start. Anyway, it took me an awfully long time. And I worked with somebody who'd been a couple of years in school, who did speak some Swahili, and gradually as I learned Swahili, learning Swahili is just like learning any other language, with grammars and dictionaries, and you work with those, and gradually I worked my way into Swahili, and then from Swahili into Hadza, but it took an awfully long time. It was very tiresome. And I've always been interested in languages, and that helped. And I did before I went. I was already, before I went, reasonably fluent in French and in Russian, so that was a help, a bit of background. But it then helped me. It meant I was reasonably confident that I could learn the language. So that's that. So more questions.
Time for one more question, unless we want to vote on an extension and have another 5 minutes. But
Extension.
do we want an extension?
Yeah.
Everyone, hands up who wants an extension. Oh, everybody. Okay, we've got an extension. Fantastic. Okay, right.
Could you comment, please, on any possible relationship between hunting and stringed musical instruments?
The Hadza and many other hunters make their bows into a stringed musical instrument. They use musical bows. They're able to vary the tension in the bowstring and to attach a gourd or some other sounding receptacle to the bow, and then can by varying the tension on the bowstring can use this as a musical instrument, and it is likely that a number of stringed instruments will have developed out of musical bows, but that kind of association may well be true, but I don't know whether that's true.
It's explicitly stated in a Zulu myth, I know, but I was interested whether the actual hunters themselves would make that connection.
I don't think the hunters themselves are able to generalize about other hunters. I mean, the Hadza barely know about any other hunter, about any other hunters in the world. What the Hadza were always interested in, when I talked about there being other hunter-gatherers, is they said, do they have epeme? Do they have the sacred ritual, which we have? Because that, for them, was the key to their culture.
The answer is, in a sense, they probably do, but they wouldn't call it epony.
Well,
It does seem to be as if the hunter,
yeah. Anyway,
Do
yes,
they use cat's cradle with the string figures in their storytelling? Cat's cradle, the strings.
Oh yes, they can do that, as very many African peoples do.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen in recent years. I don't remember seeing that for very many years.
But they did do it before.
They did do it, yes. Cat's cradles. It's terribly widespread in the world's population.
Louis Leakey wrote a small pamphlet for Angola back in the 50s.
Yeah, no, you do find it very widely, not just in Africa, but in many other.
Australia.
Well,
Yes, it's all
we've probably got time for one more question. Yes, Randy?
Yeah, just a suggestion, James. Why don't you install yourself in Tanzania for a certain length of time and then lots of anthropology enthusiasts can come and visit you, and you can live in luxury.
What about all my grandchildren?
Well, they can come too.
I don't know if they would all want to. But no, it is difficult. I mean, I have, and what about cycling? Cycling's not too easy in Hadza country. There are lots of things that I want to do. I've got, and it's a bit late for me to base myself in Tanzania, but I might well have just stayed at the end of my field research and never to have come back here, never to have talked to nice audiences like yourselves.
Okay, I think that's it. Thanks ever so much.